Camp Concordia, Kansas, June 18, 1944, 0730 hours. Oberleutnant Friedrich Weber stands behind the barbed wire perimeter of his new prison, watching American guards distribute breakfast to the compound, and he cannot reconcile what he sees with everything the Reich told him about the barbaric Americans who would torture and starve German prisoners. Weber, a veteran of the Afrika Korps captured at Tunisia, has spent the last 3 weeks expecting systematic brutality, preparing himself mentally for the deprivation and cruelty that Goebbels' propaganda promised awaited all German soldiers unfortunate enough to fall into enemy hands. What Weber cannot possibly know, what no German officer could imagine in their darkest considerations, is that within hours, he will sit down to a meal containing more protein than he consumed in an entire week on the front lines, that he will sleep in a heated barracks with running water, and that the greatest shock of his captivity will not be American cruelty, but American abundance. And within days, the carefully constructed worldview that sustained him through years of warfare will begin cracking as he confronts a reality so fundamentally different from Nazi ideology that it will force him to question everything he believed about the war, the enemy, and the Reich itself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The German military's confidence in their ideological preparation comes from years of indoctrination, from the belief that National Socialist philosophy has hardened them against enemy propaganda, from the certainty that German discipline and spirit will sustain them even in captivity. Hauptmann Klaus Richter, commanding a group of Luftwaffe prisoners at Camp Alva, Oklahoma, has internalized the Führer's teachings about American decadence and weakness, believing that the mongrel democracy across the Atlantic lacks the steel necessary to wage total war. He expects prison camps run with the chaos and inefficiency that Nazi ideology attributes to democratic societies, disorganized, poorly supplied, staffed by incompetent guards who represent the dregs of American military manpower. The Nazi propaganda machine has spent years preparing German soldiers for every contingency except the one they will actually face. Feldwebel Hans Dietrich, a panzer crewman captured in Normandy, arrives at Camp Hearne, Texas, expecting conditions similar to the Soviet gulags described in Wehrmacht briefings: brutal guards, starvation rations, forced labor designed to break prisoners' spirits. The mental preparation the Wehrmacht provides focuses on maintaining discipline under hardship, resisting interrogation through torture, and preserving unit cohesion in the face of deliberate attempts to divide prisoners. Officers receive special briefings about maintaining the chain of command in captivity, ensuring that even behind wire, German military hierarchy remains intact and soldiers remember their oaths to the Führer. What makes June 1944 different from any previous war in history is not immediately apparent to the German prisoners being processed through reception centers across the American heartland. Underoffizier Martin Schneider, watching American clerks efficiently record his personal information at Camp Ruston, Louisiana, assumes this bureaucratic precision merely precedes the systematic abuse he has been warned about. The processing seems almost respectful, American officers addressing him by rank, medical personnel examining him thoroughly, quartermasters issuing him clean clothing, but Schneider interprets this as psychological warfare, a deliberate contrast before the inevitable cruelty begins. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The development of the American POW camp system represents one of the most remarkable humanitarian undertakings in military history, born from a national commitment to upholding the Geneva Convention even when dealing with enemies who had themselves violated it repeatedly. Major General Allen Gullion, Provost Marshal General of the United States Army, understood that treating prisoners humanely served multiple purposes: maintaining American moral authority, encouraging enemy soldiers to surrender rather than fight to the death, and demonstrating to the world the superiority of democratic values over fascist ideology. Working with the International Red Cross and State Department officials, Gullion established protocols that would ensure American POW camps not only met Geneva Convention standards but exceeded them. The construction of these camps across the American interior required massive logistical efforts and financial investment that German prisoners could not comprehend. Camp Shelby, Mississippi, built to house 3,000 German POWs, featured barracks with electric lighting, indoor plumbing, recreational facilities, and kitchens equipped to prepare meals that met nutritional standards exceeding those of the German army's own field rations. The cost per prisoner exceeded $1,000 annually, more than many American families earned in a year, representing a commitment to humane treatment that seemed almost incomprehensible to men who came from a society that measured human worth by racial hierarchy and utility to the state. The medical facilities available to German prisoners particularly shocked those who arrived expecting neglect. Sanitätsunteroffizier Paul Becker, a medical corpsman captured in Italy, finds himself assigned to the camp hospital at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, where American doctors treat German prisoners with the same equipment and medications used for American soldiers. The hospital stocks penicillin, the miracle drug that German forces desperately lack, and American physicians use it freely on German POWs suffering from infected wounds. Becker watches in amazement as an American surgeon performs a complex appendectomy on a German private, utilizing techniques and resources that would be reserved only for high-ranking officers in Wehrmacht hospitals. The first meal served to prisoners becomes a watershed moment in their captivity, the point where Nazi propaganda begins colliding with undeniable reality. Gefreiter Otto Lehmann, arriving at Camp Trinidad, Colorado, after weeks of minimal rations during transport from North Africa, expects thin soup and moldy bread, the starvation diet that propaganda ministry films suggested awaited prisoners of the plutocratic Americans. Instead, he receives a tray containing pot roast with gravy, mashed potatoes, green beans, fresh bread with butter, and apple pie for dessert. The portion sizes seem absurd, more food than he has seen on a single plate since before the war. Lehmann initially refuses to eat, suspecting the food is drugged or poisoned, part of some elaborate interrogation scheme. The American commitment to feeding prisoners according to Geneva Convention standards, rations equivalent to those provided to American soldiers, creates profound psychological impact on men who have spent years under the Wehrmacht's increasingly inadequate supply system. Oberfeldwebel Wilhelm Koch, a veteran of the Russian front captured in France, calculates that his daily caloric intake at Camp Mexia, Texas, exceeds 3,000 calories, more than double what he received during the final months before capture. The meat alone in each meal represents a luxury that ordinary German civilians have not experienced since 1941. Koch watches American guards casually discard leftover food, waste that would feed a German family for days, and struggles to reconcile this abundance with the Endsieg propaganda about Germany's inevitable victory over resource-poor democracies. The psychological warfare the prisoners expect never materializes because American camp commanders understand that humane treatment itself serves a more powerful purpose than coercion. Colonel Daniel Hogan, commanding Camp Como, Mississippi, instructs his guards that every interaction with prisoners should demonstrate American values, fairness, respect for human dignity, and adherence to international law. Hogan understands what the prisoners do not yet grasp, that the greatest threat to Nazi ideology comes not from re-education programs or propaganda leaflets, but from the simple daily reality of being treated as human beings deserving of dignity and care. The recreational facilities available to prisoners seem almost obscene to men expecting harsh confinement. Lieutenant Ernst Zimmerman, assigned to Camp Crossville, Tennessee, discovers that prisoners have access to a library containing thousands of books, sports equipment for football and volleyball, materials for crafts and hobbies, and even musical instruments. The camp sponsors inter-barracks competitions, theatrical productions, and educational courses. Zimmerman, who spent 3 years in the Afrika Korps enduring constant deprivation, finds himself playing chess in a heated recreation hall while American guards bring hot coffee, real coffee, not the ersatz chicory mixture German soldiers have consumed since 1942. The work programs available to prisoners who volunteer for labor details further demolish the narrative of American barbarity. Obergefreiter Heinrich Muller, working on a farm near Camp Clarinda, Iowa, receives wages for his labor, 80 cents per day in camp scrip that can be used in the canteen to purchase luxuries like cigarettes, candy, and toiletries. The farmers he works for treat him with casual friendliness, sometimes inviting him to share lunch with their families, offering him fresh milk and homemade bread. Muller, raised on propaganda about Jewish-controlled America's hatred of all Germans, cannot reconcile these experiences with the ideology that defined his understanding of the war. The mail system particularly impacts prisoners' perception of their captivity, as letters from home reveal conditions in Germany that contradict everything they have been told about the home front's strength and unity. Feldwebel Gustav Braun, reading letters from his wife in Hamburg, learns about the devastating air raids that have destroyed entire neighborhoods, the ration system that provides insufficient food, and the increasingly desperate situation on all fronts. His wife writes in veiled language, careful not to criticize the regime, but the subtext is clear: Germany is losing the war, civilian morale is collapsing, and the promised wonder weapons and final victories seem increasingly like propaganda fantasies. Braun compares his wife's descriptions of near starvation in Germany with his own situation in Camp Huntsville, Texas, where he has gained 15 pounds since capture. The International Red Cross inspections validate what prisoners are experiencing but initially refuse to believe. When Red Cross representative Dr. Henri Corsia visits Camp Forest, Tennessee, conducting interviews without American guards present, German prisoners initially assume he is an American plant. Only when Corsia shows them his Swiss diplomatic credentials and explains the inspection process do some prisoners begin accepting that the treatment they are receiving is not an elaborate deception but actual American policy. Corsia's report notes that conditions exceed Geneva Convention requirements in most categories, with particular praise for medical care, housing quality, and recreational opportunities. The presence of German officers within camps who remain committed to Nazi ideology creates its own dynamic as they attempt to maintain military discipline and prevent what they call demoralization among enlisted prisoners. Hauptmann Werner Krauss, senior German officer at Camp Concordia, Kansas, establishes an internal camp government that enforces Wehrmacht regulations, conducts mourning formations, and punishes prisoners who become too friendly with American guards. Krauss views the comfortable conditions as a sophisticated form of psychological warfare designed to break German fighting spirit, and he works to maintain ideological purity among his men through lectures about National Socialist principles and the temporary nature of their setback. But Krauss faces an impossible task because the evidence of American prosperity and power surrounds prisoners constantly, impossible to ignore or explain away. The American guards themselves, many of whom are too old for combat duty or recovering from wounds, represent a cross-section of American society that contradicts Nazi racial theory. Sergeant James Washington, an African-American guard at Camp Ruston, Louisiana, speaks fluent German and treats prisoners with professional courtesy, his mere presence challenging the Nazi hierarchy of races. The Jewish American officers and guards that Nazi ideology portrayed as manipulative cowards prove to be competent professionals who enforce camp regulations fairly and without the cruelty that propaganda predicted. The camp newspapers, approved by American authorities but produced by German prisoners, reflect the growing cognitive dissonance within the POW population. Der Ruf, published at camps across the United States, begins as a vehicle for maintaining German morale and unity, but gradually evolves into something more complex as editors grapple with the reality of their situation. Early editions focus on stories of German military heroism and cultural achievements, carefully avoiding any criticism of the regime. But later issues include increasingly frank discussions about post-war reconstruction, democracy, and the mistakes that led Germany into its current catastrophe, subjects that would be unthinkable in the Reich itself. The educational programs offered to prisoners represent the most sophisticated attempt at what Americans carefully avoid calling re-education, providing opportunities for Germans to encounter ideas and perspectives that Nazi censorship had suppressed. Professor Howard Mumford Jones, working with the Special Projects Division of the Provost Marshal General's Office, develops curricula that expose prisoners to Western philosophy, comparative government, and uncensored history without overt propaganda. The approach assumes that intelligent men given access to information will draw their own conclusions about the merits of different political systems, a faith in human rationality that the Nazi system never trusted. Lieutenant Carl Weber, attending lectures at Camp McCain, Mississippi, finds himself reading the American Declaration of Independence, the French Rights of Man, and German philosophers like Kant and Schopenhauer whose works the Nazis had restricted or reinterpreted. Weber, educated in Nazi schools that presented history as racial struggle and democracy as Jewish conspiracy, encounters for the first time the intellectual traditions that his education systematically excluded. The lectures do not tell him what to think. American instructors carefully avoid direct criticism of Germany, but simply present alternative frameworks for understanding politics, society, and human rights. The breaking point for many prisoners comes not from any single revelation but from the accumulation of small daily observations that cannot be reconciled with Nazi ideology. Oberstfreiter Franz Hartmann, working in the camp kitchen at Fort Lewis, Washington, notices the casual waste that Americans consider normal: food discarded because it is slightly overcooked, supplies replaced before they are exhausted, equipment upgraded while the old versions still function perfectly. The abundance seems almost sinister to a man who has internalized the necessity of total efficiency and resource conservation that characterized German wartime society. How can a nation so wasteful, so undisciplined, so individualistic possibly be winning the war against the disciplined efficiency of the Reich? The answer becomes unavoidable as prisoners gain access to uncensored news through American newspapers and radio broadcasts. The camp at Algona, Iowa, maintains a reading room where German prisoners can access current newspapers and magazines, the content unfiltered except for operational military information that might compromise security. Hauptfeldwebel Rudolf Schmidt, reading about the Normandy invasion in the Des Moines Register, realizes that German propaganda's claims about repulsing the invasion are lies. The Americans and British have established a massive beachhead and are pushing inland against weakening German resistance. More shocking than the military news is the casual discussion of strategic matters in the American press, the open debate about military strategy and political decisions that would be treasonous in Germany. The treatment of wounded prisoners provides the most powerful testimony to the fundamental difference between American and German values. Gefreiter Johann Kruger, recovering from severe wounds sustained during his capture in Italy, receives surgery at the camp hospital in Fort Sam Houston, Texas, where American surgeons used the latest techniques to save his leg. An amputation would have been almost certain in a Wehrmacht field hospital. The American doctors treat him exactly as they would treat one of their own wounded soldiers, with no distinction based on nationality or enemy status. The nurse who changes his dressings, a first-generation German-American named Helen Schmidt, speaks to him in German about her family's immigration from Bavaria, creating a bridge between enemy and caregiver that confuses all Kruger's assumptions about American hostility toward Germans. The contrast between prisoner expectations and reality creates a psychological crisis that American camp commanders neither anticipate nor fully understand in the early months of the POW program. Captain Robert Mitchell, commanding the guard force at Camp Pine Bluff, Arkansas, notices that newly arrived prisoners often refuse to believe the conditions they encounter are permanent, insisting among themselves that the good treatment is temporary, a psychological trick that will end once they provide information or sign propaganda statements. Mitchell observes German NCOs conducting whispered meetings in barracks corners, warning enlisted men not to be deceived by American kindness, predicting that the real brutality will begin once the Americans have lulled them into complacency. The cognitive dissonance becomes particularly acute for prisoners who have served on the Eastern Front and witnessed Wehrmacht treatment of Soviet prisoners. Underoffizier Stefan Wolf, captured during the Battle of the Bulge after 3 years fighting in Russia, arrives at Camp Chaffee, Arkansas, carrying memories of Soviet POWs starved to death in open pens, worked until they collapsed, treated as subhuman vermin worthy only of extermination. The Nazi racial ideology that justified such treatment taught Wolf that different peoples operate according to different moral codes, that Slavs are naturally brutal while Germanic peoples maintain civilized standards. But nothing in his ideological framework prepared him for Americans treating German prisoners better than Germans treated their own wounded soldiers in field hospitals. The Christmas of 1944 becomes a pivotal moment for many prisoners as American camp authorities organize elaborate celebrations that expose the depth of American commitment to humane treatment. At Camp Hearn, Texas, the camp commander authorizes prisoners to construct a traditional German Christmas market, complete with handcrafted decorations, a choir performing traditional carols, and a feast that includes roast goose, potato dumplings, red cabbage, and stollen, dishes that most prisoners have not tasted since before the war. Oberstfreiter Ludwig Bauer, participating in the Christmas Eve service, finds himself weeping not from homesickness but from the profound confusion of being treated with such consideration by people his government has declared mortal enemies. The presence of German-American citizens among camp guards and staff creates particularly powerful moments of revelation for prisoners convinced that America's ethnic diversity represents weakness and internal conflict. Private First Class Walter Hoffman, a second-generation German-American from Wisconsin, serves as interpreter at Camp Mexia, Texas, where his fluent German and understanding of German culture allow him to explain American society in ways prisoners can comprehend. Hoffman tells them about his family's immigration in 1923, their successful integration into American society, his father's business in Milwaukee, and his own decision to enlist after Pearl Harbor. For prisoners taught that ethnic Germans in America live as oppressed minorities in a Jewish-dominated society, Hoffman's obvious pride in his American identity and loyalty to his adopted country cannot be reconciled with Nazi propaganda. The work programs that allow prisoners to interact directly with American civilians provide the most transformative experiences. Gefreiter Hans Bergman, assigned to a logging crew in Oregon, works alongside American lumberjacks who treat him with casual camaraderie, sharing their lunch, teaching him American slang, and discussing their lives with an openness that astounds him. These working-class Americans, who Nazi ideology portrayed as exploited proletarians suffering under capitalist oppression, own automobiles, live in comfortable homes, and speak freely about their government, criticizing policies they disagree with without fear of consequences. Bergman watches his American supervisor openly complain about rationing restrictions and vote against the incumbent mayor in a local election, demonstrations of political freedom that would result in arrest or worse in Germany. The transformation of individual prisoners occurs gradually, through accumulated observations that erode ideological certainty. Feldwebel Anton Meyer at Camp Concordia begins noticing small details, the way American guards treat each other with casual informality regardless of rank, the absence of the rigid hierarchy that defines Wehrmacht culture, the willingness of officers to explain decisions rather than simply demanding obedience. Meyer, trained to believe that discipline requires fear and that democracy inevitably produces chaos, cannot understand how the American military functions effectively without the harsh punishment system that characterizes German forces. Yet the camp operates smoothly, guards perform their duties professionally, and the informal American style somehow produces results. The access to uncensored information accelerates the ideological transformation as prisoners gain perspective on the war's progress that German propaganda never provided. At Camp Alva, Oklahoma, Lieutenant Victor Stein reads Time magazine's coverage of the Soviet advance into Poland, the detailed maps showing German forces in continuous retreat, the casualty figures that suggest Wehrmacht losses far exceed anything Berlin admits. Stein, who volunteered for the Luftwaffe in 1939 believing in Germany's cultural and military superiority, must confront evidence that the Reich is not merely losing battles but collapsing completely. The American press discusses German defeats with analytical detachment rather than triumphalism, focusing on strategic implications rather than gloating over enemy suffering, a restraint that seems almost incomprehensible to someone accustomed to Nazi propaganda's hysterical tone. The personal relationships that develop between some prisoners and American civilians represent the most profound challenge to Nazi racial ideology. Obergefreiter Ernst Fischer, working on a farm near Camp Clarinda, Iowa, forms a friendship with the farmer's teenage son, David, who asks endless questions about Germany, shares his dreams of attending college, and treats Fischer as a knowledgeable adult rather than an enemy. Fischer finds himself explaining German history and culture to this curious American teenager, gradually realizing that his explanations increasingly omit Nazi ideology, that he is describing a Germany that existed before 1933, a cultural heritage that. The letters prisoners send home, carefully censored by American authorities to prevent military information from reaching Germany but otherwise unrestricted, begin reflecting the transformation occurring in American camps. Hauptmann George Schroeder, writing to his wife in Stuttgart from Camp Ruston, Louisiana, describes his situation in terms carefully chosen to avoid both American censorship and Gestapo attention, but his subtext is clear: he is safe, well-fed, and treated fairly. His wife's responses, when they arrive weeks later, describe conditions in Germany that make his captivity seem almost fortunate: cities destroyed by bombing, food shortages approaching famine levels, and a pervasive fear that prevents people from speaking honestly even within families. Schroeder realizes he is living better as a prisoner in America than his wife lives as a loyal German citizen in the Reich. The Nazi hardcore within camps, officers and enlisted men who remain committed to the ideology despite all evidence, create their own resistance structure, attempting to maintain Wehrmacht discipline and Nazi loyalty through intimidation and violence. At Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, Hauptmann Rolf Dietrich organizes a secret tribunal that tries prisoners accused of collaboration with Americans, handing down sentences including beatings and, in extreme cases, execution. The murder of Gefreiter Johannes Kunz, beaten to death by fellow prisoners for being too friendly with American guards, shocks camp authorities into realizing that their humane treatment policy has created an unintended consequence, making it possible for Nazi fanatics to enforce ideological conformity through terror. The American response to internal camp violence demonstrates another contrast between democratic and totalitarian approaches to authority. Rather than punishing entire compounds collectively, the Wehrmacht method, camp authorities investigate individual crimes, arrest specific perpetrators, and try them in American courts where they receive due process. The trials of prisoners accused of murdering fellow POWs scandalize German hardliners who assume that American tolerance of dissent means weakness, yet the convictions and executions of those found guilty demonstrate that American justice, while fair, is also absolute. Lieutenant Werner Drexler's execution by fellow prisoners at Camp Papago Park, Arizona, and the subsequent trial and hanging of 7 Germans involved, shows prisoners that American law applies equally to everyone, protecting those who cooperate while punishing those who commit violence. The spring of 1945 brings news of Germany's collapse that forces even the most committed Nazis to confront reality. As American newspapers report the discovery of concentration camps, the full extent of Nazi atrocities begins emerging in ways that German propaganda cannot explain or justify. Oberleutnant Karl Brandt, reading about Buchenwald's liberation in the camp newspaper at Fort Sam Houston, initially dismisses the reports as Allied propaganda, the photographs of emaciated corpses and mass graves too extreme to be credible. But as multiple independent sources confirm the same information, as American soldiers who participated in the liberations arrive at camps to share their eyewitness accounts, Brandt's certainty begins crumbling. The regime he served, the ideology he believed in, the cause for which he fought, all suddenly appear in a horrifying new context. The forced viewing of concentration camp footage by German prisoners remains controversial among American authorities, with some arguing it constitutes psychological cruelty while others insist Germans must confront what was done in their name. At Camp Concordia, the decision to screen documentary footage from Dachau and Bergen-Belsen creates powerful reactions, some prisoners weeping openly, others sitting in stunned silence, a few stalking out in denial. Feldwebel Peter Krauss, watching American soldiers bulldoze mountains of corpses into mass graves, feels his entire worldview shattering. The images cannot be explained away as propaganda or fabrication, the sheer scale of death, the systematic nature of the killing, the evidence of deliberate extermination all point to crimes that transcend normal warfare. The debate among prisoners about German responsibility for Nazi crimes creates divisions that mirror those that will plague Germany for decades. Some prisoners argue they knew nothing about the camps, that they were simple soldiers fighting for their country rather than for Nazi ideology. Others acknowledge that rumors of atrocities circulated throughout the Wehrmacht, that soldiers on the Eastern Front witnessed mass executions, that willful ignorance allowed ordinary Germans to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths. Hauptmann Gustav Hellmann, leading a discussion group at Camp McCain, Mississippi, argues that claiming ignorance is no longer tenable, that Germans must acknowledge their collective responsibility for allowing Hitler to come to power and for supporting or tolerating a regime whose criminal nature should have been apparent. The surrender of Germany in May 1945 eliminates the last justification for Nazi ideology, the claim that Germany fights for survival against enemies bent on its destruction. Lieutenant Franz Koch, listening to radio broadcasts of Germany's unconditional surrender at Camp Huntsville, Texas, realizes that all the sacrifices, all the suffering, all the deaths served a regime that led Germany to total defeat and moral catastrophe. The thousand-year Reich lasted 12 years, the final victory never came, and the master race lies defeated by the democratic nation's Nazi ideology dismissed as decadent and weak. For prisoners who maintained hope that Germany would somehow achieve victory, the surrender removes any remaining possibility of ideological vindication. The post-war period brings new challenges as prisoners face the reality that they cannot return immediately to Germany, that their homeland lies in ruins, under occupation, with no functioning government or economy. The American policy of retaining German POWs for labor while Europe rebuilds creates resentment among some prisoners who feel their captivity should end with the war, but also allows others time to process their experiences and prepare for a transformed Germany. Obergefreiter Johann Schwartz, working on road construction in Georgia, uses the time to learn English, study American agricultural methods, and develop skills that might help him rebuild in a Germany that will need to completely reinvent itself. The educational programs expand dramatically after Germany's surrender, as American authorities no longer need to maintain the pretense of political neutrality. Courses on democratic governance, free market economics, civil society, and constitutional law become available to prisoners who choose to participate. Professor Thomas Burke, teaching at Camp Como, Mississippi, presents German prisoners with case studies of Weimar Germany's collapse, analyzing the economic, political, and social factors that allowed extremism to triumph. Burke does not lecture prisoners about their guilt but instead engages them in serious intellectual discussion about how democracies fail and how they can be protected, treating them as intelligent adults capable of learning from catastrophic mistakes. The repatriation process beginning in 1946 forces prisoners to confront what they will find upon returning to Germany. Letters from home describe cities reduced to rubble, populations on the edge of starvation, an economy based on barter and black markets, and an occupying force that treats Germans with suspicion and coldness very different from their American captivity. Gefreiter Otto Wagner, preparing to return to Hamburg from Camp Hearn, Texas, realizes he has lived better for the past 2 years as a prisoner in America than he will likely live for years to come in occupied Germany. The irony is not lost on him, that defeat in captivity provided him with comfort and security that victory could never have delivered. The friendships formed between prisoners and Americans create complications during repatriation as some prisoners have developed genuine affection for the country that held them captive. Feldwebel Heinrich Stein, saying goodbye to the Iowa farming family he worked for over 18 months, receives an invitation to return to America as an immigrant once regulations permit. The farmer's offer reflects the relationships that developed when ideology gave way to human interaction, when German prisoners and American civilians discovered they had more in common than the war suggested. Stein promises to consider the offer, knowing that Germany's future remains uncertain while America's prosperity seems limitless. The long-term impact of the POW experience on individual Germans proves difficult to quantify but manifests in various ways over subsequent decades. Many former prisoners become advocates for German-American friendship in the post-war years, joining cultural exchange programs, business partnerships, and political organizations that promote reconciliation. Oberleutnant Kerr Hoffman, imprisoned at Camp Pine Bluff, Arkansas, returns to Germany to become a teacher who emphasizes democratic values and international cooperation in his classes, using his American experience as a counterpoint to the authoritarianism he grew up under. Others remain silent about their captivity, uncomfortable with the cognitive dissonance between their wartime service and their post-war recognition that they fought for an unjust cause. The American POW camp system represents an unprecedented experiment in humanitarian warfare, the deliberate decision to treat enemy prisoners not merely according to minimal legal requirements but according to standards that demonstrate the superiority of democratic values. General George Marshall, reflecting on the program in his post-war memoirs, argues that the treatment of German POWs served American strategic interests by encouraging surrender, demonstrating American power and prosperity, and beginning the process of German democratization before occupation forces even entered Germany. The cost exceeded $500 million over the war's duration, but the investment produced tangible benefits in reduced resistance and accelerated post-war reconciliation. The contrast between American treatment of German POWs and German treatment of Allied prisoners, particularly Soviet prisoners, reveals fundamental differences between democratic and totalitarian approaches to human dignity. While German POWs in America gained weight and received medical care, Soviet prisoners in German camps died by the hundreds of thousands from deliberate starvation, exposure, and execution. the disparity reflects ideological commitments, Americans viewing prisoners as soldiers who deserve respect under international law, while Nazis viewed Slavic prisoners as subhuman creatures whose deaths served German racial objectives. The different outcomes demonstrate that ideology shapes not just political systems but human decency itself. The German POW experience in America influences post-war German society in ways that remain understudied by historians focused on occupation policies and Marshall Plan economics. The approximately 378,000 German prisoners held in American camps represent a significant percentage of Germany's young male population, men who returned home with direct experience of democratic society, material abundance, and humane governance. Their testimonies, shared in families and communities, challenged the nihilistic despair that gripped many Germans after the war, providing evidence that reconstruction was possible and that Germany's future need not be defined by its catastrophic past. The legacy of the American POW camp system extends beyond individual transformations to influence international humanitarian law and military doctrine. The success of the program demonstrates that belligerents can maintain high standards of treatment even during total war, that humanitarian considerations need not compromise military effectiveness, and that treating prisoners with dignity serves long-term strategic interests. The Geneva Conventions revised after World War II incorporate lessons from the American experience, strengthening protections and clarifying obligations in ways informed by what worked in practice rather than merely what seemed desirable in theory. For the men who experienced American captivity, the memory remains vivid decades later, a time when their most fundamental assumptions about the world were challenged and often overturned by the simple reality of being treated as human beings deserving of dignity and care. Obergefreiter Franz Hartmann, interviewed in 1985 at age 67, describes his captivity in America as the time I learned to question everything I thought I knew about the world. The education he received came not from lectures or propaganda but from the daily experience of living in a society so fundamentally different from Nazi Germany that its mere existence refuted everything the Reich taught him. The story of German POWs in America remains one of history's overlooked narratives, overshadowed by dramatic military campaigns, strategic decisions, and the Holocaust's moral catastrophe. Yet the 378,000 German soldiers who lived in American camps and returned home to help rebuild Germany carried with them a perspective unique among their generation, direct experience of the enemy society that defeated them, knowledge that their captors possessed both the power to destroy Germany and the restraint to treat defeated enemies with humanity. In the long historical arc of German-American relations, these prisoners served as inadvertent ambassadors who learned through experience what no propaganda could teach, that democracy's strength lies not in military power alone but in the values it embodies and the human dignity it protects. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.